Getting Below the Surface: Race, Ethnicity, and Identity in Youth. Presented by AADL in partnership with the University of Michigan Department of Psychology.
So tonight we're very fortunate to have Dr. Debbie Rivas-Drake present some of her really interesting work for us. Debbie is an associate professor of education and psychology here at the University of Michigan. Debbie received her undergraduate degree from Pace University in New York City, and then she went on to receive her PhD right here at the University of Michigan in both education and psychology. Debbie's research examines ethnic and racial processes in youth development. In particular, she explores how schools, families, peers, and communities influence the development of ethnic and racial identity, and how these identities shape youth, academic, and psychological outcomes. So tonight, Debbie's talk is entitled Getting Below the Surface: Race, Ethnicity, and Identity in Youth. So please join me in welcoming Debbie.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining me tonight to talk a little bit about these issues. I'm really pleased to be able to share some of the research that I've been doing with my colleagues and my students, as well as some ideas and thoughts that really have been ones that I've been thinking about along with my colleague, Adriana Manu-Taylor, that we have put into a book. So a lot of this is really going to be reflective of a bigger conversation, a bigger kind of set of ideas that we've been thinking about. And along the way, I will point out a couple of places where it reflects my specific research. So as Chris said, the title of my talk is Getting Below the Surface: Race, Ethnicity, and Identity in Youth. I'm going to walk through a little bit of the background for why I think this is an important topic, thinking about, sort of what it means to learn about race or learn race in the context of the United States. And then we're going to walk through a little bit about what we mean when we say ethnic racial identity or ethnic identity racial identity. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we know about how identity matters for different types of indicators of well-being in adolescence specifically, and then think about how identity, ERI in particular, can be a resource for thinking about how young people interact across difference. And we'll keep moving through and thinking about examples. I'm going to walk through some examples of school, community, and family strategies for taking up these issues, and then wrap up with some takeaways. So we know that the U.S. is changing. Young people in this country are growing up in a social society or social world that is diversifying every day. One of the things that I really like to highlight, and when I talk about these issues, is that as they grow up, they are learning about lots of different things, and race is one of the things that they learn. And so to help kind of frame this and think about this, I like to look at a quote, or I like to present a quote by Dalton Conley, who is a sociologist. He actually studies other kinds of issues, but he wrote a memoir about what it was like to grow up white in a housing project that was predominantly Black and Latino. And he writes from that experience, kind of reflecting on that experience, that learning race is like learning a language. First, we try mouthing all sounds, then we learn which are not sounds and which have meaning to the people around us, and which do have meaning to the people around us. So one of the things that this idea conveys is that, or this quote conveys, is that race is something that we learn along the way. It's socialized. It's not something that we are born knowing everything we need to know about race or thinking about race. And the same is true for ethnicity, I would argue. It's also something that is social in that we learn most significantly from family members and people that we, sort of are close to us. But we also think about these issues, or young people think about these issues, or are exposed to ideas about race due to broader patterns in our society. So one of the patterns that you probably hear a lot about is that youth are actually one of the most diverse segments of our population. So the arrow is actually pointing to our kindergartners. I like to say that the way that the demographic landscape is changing means that kindergartners are growing up in a world that will be unrecognizable to us. Some of the changes are reflected in the demographics. So we know, according to census projections, that the white population is declining relative to other groups. By 2060, we'll have about 57% of the population will be ethnic minorities. And we will become a majority minority nation for the first time around 2043. They keep also, like, the years keep inching up too, so that's relatively recent, but it may be even sooner than that. And so young people or youth today, like my kids who are 6, are going to grow up in a world that, like, by the time they're, let's see, my age, maybe, like, it'll be closer to a plurality. And so that's one of the broader patterns that we're seeing and that youth are experiencing that convey ideas about race and ethnicity, and just sort of like demography is changing. But there are, of course, many other messages that youth get. And some of them are reflected in these headlines, which I can pick up my phone and every single day pick out a headline that conveys something about how race operates in the U.S. and specifically what's happening with young people. So here's one about bias that preschool children, and specifically African-American children, are exposed to. Here's one about black hair. This is a famous case. It's from a couple of years ago. I think you all remember. Yes, I'm seeing some head nods. Great. And here's one that I really like, which is actually in the sense that it's a little bit different, in the sense that these teens have taken a cultural rite of passage known as the quinceañera and used it as a form of protest, and sort of taken it to protest anti-immigrant sentiment in their Texas city. So I am only showing you examples. These are not meant to be definitive, exhaustive by any means. They're just examples of how young people and issues of race and ethnicity pop up every single day. Of course, these are not even the most significant headlines, potentially, but these are just some. And youth teens are picking up on these broader societal messages. I know in my own research, I've asked teens to tell me a little bit about, or tell us, some of my team is here, so I want to say us, a little bit about how they're thinking about their ethnicity or their race has changed. And over the course of the election year, one student wrote, nothing really happened to me, and it may be characteristically teenage fashion, like nothing really happened to me to make me think differently about my ethnicity, except for Donald Trump calling Mexicans rapists, drug lords, and troublemakers. And she is of Mexican origin. So really, a lot of the societal messages are negative and they're pervasive, but they're not only negative, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. But one of the, messages that I want to make sure is clear is that I would argue that really having opportunities to think through these different kinds of messages that youth get is really important to do now while they're young, not just when they're very young, but even during the teenage years and in adolescence in particular, because these are shaping the views and the worldview that they bring as they grow up. And into their experiences and race relations as adults. So it's important to pay attention to them now in youth for the implications that they might have as they grow up and become neighbors, potentially parents, citizens, and coworkers in a more diverse world. So let's go a little bit deeper into some of the social influences on ethnic racial identity. And yes, I have not defined that term yet, but I will get there, I promise. I want to just kind of keep us thinking about what are the different kinds of experiences that adolescents have that help them to develop something we call identity. And then we'll unpack what that means a little bit later on. So these are just some of the contexts that are really important, that we know from the field are really important. And for each of these, I'm going to give you an example of a kind of strategy, but and so it's actually it illustrates an approach for which there's a lot of literature, a lot of research, but I'm not going to cite all the different studies. So if you have questions about specific things that I'm bringing up, specific issues, strategies, or studies that you would like me to point you to, please let me know afterward, because I'm totally happy to do that and really excited to do that. But I just wanted to sort of get us thinking about the examples like in a more concrete way rather than referring to a finding in a study. So this quote is from a teen who is Vietnamese, and she says in her family, this is what she's taught about being Vietnamese. This is how she's learned what it means to be a Vietnamese. She says, I'm Vietnamese and I can speak Vietnamese because my family is all Vietnamese. So it's like hard to just like forget my culture because it's like they're at home, like they're not going to convert to English just for me. So in this example, we are kind of hearing that, exposure to heritage language is important, part of how she defines being Vietnamese. It's in the family, she's learning about being Vietnamese, and speaking the heritage language is important. She's not going to forget the culture, it's kind of reinforced, and because they're using it all the time. And this is kind of an example of what we call cultural socialization in the field, or ethnic socialization. And it's probably the most commonly used type of strategy by parents. So parents want to pass down beliefs, values, traditions, a sense of heritage, and they'll do it but with language, and they'll also do it with just, kind of conveying like this is something that you should value, or just teaching values or reinforcing values and norms that are thought to be kind of part of one's culture. And maybe create opportunities, make sure that they're exposed to other people who share those values, who are aware and participate in traditions, and also maybe heritage language speakers if you speak another language. And so that's one way that young people learn about race and ethnicity in the family. Here's another example. This one comes from a Mexican parent, actually, not a teen, a parent who says this is explaining like what and why she thinks is important why she thinks it's important to teach, and then what she's teaching about their ethnicity. And she writes, I think more than anything instilling in them, she didn't write, she says, I think more than anything instilling in them the pride of being Hispanic, of being Mexican, the respect, the family, to feel proud of being Mexican, because unfortunately racism exists here, and well, to prepare them a little. So there's like a couple of different things going on here. One is kind of a sense of pride and connection to the group, and being Mexican is really important, and she definitely wants her child to have that. And she may be doing that through heritage language exposure. She may be doing that through, just teaching them about what it's like to be, growing up in Mexico or whatever. But at the same time, she's also talking about racism and potential exposure to racism that she thinks her child may encounter. And also she's connecting the cultural socialization, sort of like connecting the idea that knowing something about where you're from, or just having connection to that group can be a little bit protective when you encounter this, or when they encounter this racism, like having not just that kind of sense of what their group is, not be defined just by the racism, but also by the experience, by this sense of pride and something positive. So they're kind of like enmeshed in this. And we call the discussions about racism and teaching about racism in the field preparation for bias. Another really very clear example of preparation for bias happens in many African American homes, and it's referred to as the talk. And this is just an example of many different kinds of discussions that can happen, or conversations, difficult conversations that can happen in families where they understand that their child is likely to be exposed to explicit racism and mistreatment due to being Black. And so this actually is an example of one person's recollection of what the talk was for them. And we actually pulled this from a blog. So this author wrote about the talk in their home. And I think it was like, there's a lot of talk about the talk because there are like commercials that have like alluded to it now. And so we actually see it in mainstream media. We see examples of the talk. In any case, this was the talk for them. They said, for me, it went like this. If you're pulled over in your car, keep your hands on the steering wheel. If your registration is in your glove box, tell the officer that you're going to retrieve it from there and move slowly. If you are stopped by an officer while you're on the street, keep your hands visible. And these are basically strategies to prevent, obviously, the most negative outcome that we could imagine from interacting with law enforcement, knowing that many times those interactions are fraught with bias. And so that's another kind of message, again, that's something we call preparation for bias. And the talk is one example of that. When we talk about teens, of course, the family doesn't lose. I mean, it's very important, but peers become very significant as well in thinking about ethnicity and race. Just like with other aspects of their lives, they pick up a lot from their friends and peers more generally. This quote reflects an experience of neither belonging neither here nor there for the author who wrote a book called Fresh Off the Boat, on which the TV show is based. And I like this example because it shows how, as he writes in this memoir, like his experience of being Chinese was not quite like what his parents was or is, and neither was it like an American white experience. And being American wasn't the American white experience. But he also liked hip hop, so he didn't quite know exactly where he would, what. It didn't feel like many people identified as Chinese and American in the same way that he did. So he says from his peers, he gets the message, all my life people would call me this derogatory term, which I won't repeat. I couldn't listen to hip hop and be myself without people questioning my authenticity. Chinese people questioned my yellowness because I was born in America. Then white people questioned my identity as an American because I was yellow. We can't win. And so that's a very complex set of messages that he received growing up. And there is a lot written about stereotypes of Asian Americans and acculturation issues in children of immigrants. And so his experience kind of reflects a little bit of the intersection of these. But we also know that we've been thinking about peers, the role of peers and the messages that peers convey about ethnicity and race and what it means, like who can belong and who belongs and what it means to be part of your group for like a long time. And it's actually not just a question that comes up in the US. So when we think about peers in school, often the frame that, is like an intuitive way to think about it is the way that Beverly Tatum posed in her classic book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria? And this is actually a study that tried to map cafeteria like seating patterns, which I thought was really neat and different. And I'm not going to explain the map, but just know that this is a map of a lunchroom or cafeteria, but it's not actually in the US. So this is actually from the UK, and the question that the authors were posing was about white British children and South Asian kids, and those were the kids that were navigating. Those were the seating patterns and the segregation patterns that they were trying to understand in this study. So, but this is just an example of one way, that we can actually systematically sort of look at what's happening with kids and their peers and race relations in school and what signals that sends about identity issues. We know that peers become really important across adolescence increasingly. Youth draw a lot of information about who they are and where they belong from their peers. We also know that peers are a source of information about, not just you belonging to your in-group and what it means to be part of an in-group, but also how your in-group relates to out-groups or groups other than your own. And also the peer context in a school has its own sort of like culture and set of norms around ethnic and racial relations. So how different in-groups and out-groups relate to each other in hierarchies and how permeable different boundaries are. In my research, I've actually looked at, how much young or adolescents are picking up from their friends in particular, which is a kind of a subset of peers. And we find that adolescence identity and different dimensions of that stays similar or becomes even more like that of their friends over time, over the course of like a year. They become more like their friends. So they really are looking to their friends. I mean, we show this in our research for this understanding of who am I and who can I be and where do I belong. But of course, peers are not the only important aspect of schools. We can look at many different aspects to think about what sorts of messages they get about ethnicity and race. We can look, the most basic issue that we can look at is the composition. So, what does it mean to be the only member of your group in a predominantly, in a setting where you're surrounded by people from another group? Going to school in a very diverse environment is actually rare in this country, but that is a different kind of experience. The curriculum that is used in the school, like what kinds of examples are used, and whose history is taught, and how is it taught, and what texts are used, all of that is sending information to kids about signaling, and is in their environment kind of conveying, what it means to be part of your ethnic group, or what ethnicity and race is in this society, and whether we talk about it or not. Pedagogy, of course, matters. And I would say that also important is the relationships. So how do youth get along with each other in a school with a particular kind of composition, and also how do adults and kids get along in that space, and who gets along, and sort of what's the nature of the discipline, for example, in an environment, and what does that convey both to people who are disciplined and also people from other groups who may not be disciplined at the same rate. So all of that is happening in the school context. In the community, we see a lot less research. There's been more research on composition of schools and peer relationships and family socialization, but there's been a lot less research, although it certainly matters at this level as well. So the composition of a community would definitely be important. Being an immigrant in a place or in a community where there has not been a long history of immigration is a different experience, and you learn and kind of space to learn about ethnicity, race, and how it matters in that space than growing up in LA, which is considered a traditional gateway in many generations and multiple groups, it's actually a super diverse city, or like New York. And so that definitely matters, although there's a lot less research on that. And finally, we see, of course, that youth will turn to their media. These are like actually media more of my generation, I feel like, because the kids are actually just looking at, like Snapchat and Instagram and other things that I don't use. But if they want to think more or learn more, they certainly can go seek it. So media is kind of an interesting context because it's not only something that can, provide information, but it's something that they can seek information from. So what they do with it, or and they can also express themselves in a different way and express their identities in a different way in the media context. Okay, so that's all about the social influences. And now it's time to define a little bit, what do I mean when I say ethnic racial identity? Well, the very first thing I want to say about it is that knowing someone's group membership or the category they belong to me, is not sufficient. It's not sufficient information for knowing what their experience of that group is. And so I'm really interested in that variability and how people who would be considered to be of the same group kind of make sense of that group in different ways. And when we think about these identity questions, there are lots of different concepts and definitions that we can bring to the conversation from the field. But I will say, and they're kind of reflected in this word cloud, but I will say that in the research on adolescence, there's actually two different areas of focus. One is the set of concepts or the aspects of identity that are thought to change over time as you become more able to reason in more sophisticated ways about ethnicity. So if you think about this, like what a 3-year-old can tell you about their identity or identification is really different than what like a 10-year-old could tell you, and really different from what a 17-year-old could tell you. And between 10 and 17, we would expect more capacity and an increase in kids' ability to construct their own identities and really make sense of these in a way that we think about it as a process. So it's changing over time. They're seeking information potentially or learning more about their heritage. That we call exploration or search. The ability to have a greater sense of clarity is what we refer to as resolution, clarity about what their identity means to them. And their sense of connection and belonging is what we refer to as commitment. So these are 3 different ways to think about the process of identity development. And we can know these things and still not really know. We can know like that they've thought about it. You can know about anyone in this room how much you've thought about it, how clear it is to you, and how much you feel a sense of belonging, and still not really know like what it means to be part of your group, to you. For that, we look at many different aspects of content as well. And these are not necessarily thought to change in as the same way as the process aspects, but they're important to think about. So there are many different aspects of content, and actually depending on what discipline you're kind of thinking through about these issues, like this is in no way comprehensive, but these are the ones that I focus on in my work. So when I say content, I mean, how important is it to your sense of self and how you define yourself? That's what we refer to as centrality. How positively or negatively do you feel about your group? That's what we refer to as private regard. And what's your sense of how other people view your group? We refer to that as public regard. So it's a lot of concepts. I'm going to give you some examples. So what does this sound like in real life? Do you want some examples of real life? Yes? Oh, okay. I'm kind of seeing some. I know it's a lot to throw out there at once. These are quotes from 2 different people. I'm gonna see if anybody can guess where the second one comes from. So it's obviously someone, famous. But the first one isn't. So the first person says, I think it gives me a feeling of how I know how I got where I am, like how my ancestors got to this country and why and exactly how exactly I am here right now. The second person says, where did I belong if I had come to understand myself as a Black American and was understood as such? That understanding remained unanchored to place. What I needed was a community, I realized. Community. And so these are both examples of what we would refer to as exploration or search. So they're trying to figure out, the second one's really clear, like about belonging. Where do they belong in the landscape of Black America and what it means to be Black American? The first person says, it's sort of something about their ancestry and their heritage, and it gives them a sense of that. And having thought about it, they have explored their identity. The first quote comes from a white teenager in Phoenix. And the second quote, does anybody have any guesses? Yes, that's right. You're the first person who's ever guessed that actually correctly, which is really interesting. Yeah, it seems obvious, but it's you are literally the first person who's ever guessed that. So thanks. So yes, and that comes from his memoir. And the reason why I use these 2 different, I could use like many different examples, but these 2 just illustrate that basically, exploration is a universal process. It can apply to any group. Anybody can explore and think about their identity and their ethnicity and their race in particular. Here's a different kind of quote. This is not a famous person. This teenager says, I'm proud to be Mexican, even if white people, some not all, might think we are not as smart or as equal to them. I love my ethnicity. I love the foods, culture, people, and many more things, presumably. Some white people out there want us to go back to our country. I guess they haven't tried our food. I am proud of my ethnicity, and I wouldn't change. It is the best. So this is actually a teenager. I think she's 15. she's talking about pride and loving her culture and her ethnicity. This is what we call private regard. And that's interspersed in there. What's really interesting about this quote is that she, at the same time, is telling us about her public regard, and it's totally interwoven. So knowing her level of pride in her group does not tell us necessarily what the public, what she thinks other people, how she thinks other people view her group. And here in the blue, you can see that obviously she perceives that other people don't really welcome Mexican. In this society, Mexicans are not really welcome. And so on, okay? And that's her experience of her identity. Knowing that she's Mexican would not tell us any of this, and it certainly wouldn't tell us anything about how much she's thought about her identity and what it means to her, even beyond these concepts. So why do I study ERI? First, it's a lens that I can use, or I and other researchers can use, to understand the experience of and responses to what we call cultural stressors. So experiences of dehumanization, marginalization, discrimination, and for immigrants, acculturation stress that might occur as they're learning a new country or their children are adapting to a new environment. And we really think about this ERI as part of a set of assets. And there are many different kinds of assets, but these are a particular kind, which are cultural assets. So along with having community-oriented values, which we think are positive things for kids, and development of a sense of socio-political agency, we know that having a feeling that you there belong to a group and feeling a sense of belonging and having a sense of identity is an important asset for youth. And in thinking about ERI, we think about it as a cultural asset. In adolescence, it's important to think about some socioemotional needs and development, and identity is one of the very central ones. For a long time, we've theorized that, and it's shown in the literature that asking, these are not dramatic as it may appear in narratives about adolescence, but this question, they're more able to spend time thinking about questions of who am I and who can I be than children, and to do it in a more sophisticated way. And certainly by the time we're in my age, when I'm not really hanging out in this emotional space, or I try not to be, But adolescence is a key, it's prime time for thinking about these issues. And adolescence and young adulthood, I think, really are important times. Both are important times. In the context of schools, my colleague Rob Jagers and I have been thinking about how do we think about ERI as a social-emotional competency. And social-emotional competencies in schools right now, there's a framework that is very widely used called the CASA 5, and that refers to social-emotional learning competencies. And the goals of these programs and approaches are to, support the development of these different competencies. ERI really fits into two of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll just tell you that there are two of them that really make sense for thinking about ERI. So if we think that kids should know about their strengths and be self-aware, which is one of the first competencies, or one of the competencies, that they should know kind of what they're good at and what they're not good at, and be aware of their strengths and what assets they bring to a situation, ERI is one of those assets potentially. At the same time, we hope that kids will develop a sense of being able to take other people's perspectives and really, learn and want to learn about other people's experiences. And we refer to that as social awareness in this literature. And ERI is part of that. So that's one of the kind of points I want to make about why we study ERI. What do we know about how ERI is related to different indicators of well-being or youth adjustment? So in a systematic, and we'll call it a bird's eye view of the literature at that time, so 2014, we went through every study that had been published to that point from between 1990 and 2012 or 13, and sort of looked at the patterns of what are the kinds of things that these different aspects of identity are related to. And we saw, like exploration and search, like the more that kids had done this, the more positive psychosocial adjustment we saw in different populations too, different ethnicities. Things like having better self-esteem and less depression. But the lion's share of the literature really revolves around private regard. This is the most widely studied and most deeply studied aspect of ERI. And we can see there are many positive correlates, so these are all correlational, right? There are many different things that are associated with feeling good, happy, and proud as a shorthand about your ethnic and racial group. And this is true for many different groups, different ethnic and racial groups. To go a little bit more or deeper, we did a more systematic analysis, let's say, of 49 different studies that looked at this positive affect, this positive feelings about your ethnicity or race, or your private regard, affirmation, your sense of pride. And the arrows point to the strongest correlation, the most, the most, I think, the ones that really stand out to us. And what we see is psychosocial benefits like, less depression or fewer depressive symptoms, and better positive social functioning, which includes things like greater peer acceptance and greater social competence, as well as some benefits in the realm of academics and less inclination to use drugs and, various risk behaviors and attitudes that we would want them to be disinclined to. So that's for let's see, this is for 3rd to 12th grade. These studies reflected that age span, mostly middle school and high school age. Again, multiple groups. In another meta-analysis, study of studies, with an older average age, so this included young adults and adults, like in our age group, these authors reported also seeing, positive associations between feeling. Now, this time the study was of that aspect called commitment, which is like that sense of belonging and feeling connected to your group. And people who felt more connected to their ethnic racial group. And this one actually includes, I think, so it's all different age groups. Reported more positive general well-being, better self-esteem, and greater self-mastery, which is something that we think is desirable. And one other interesting thing about this kind of meta-analysis is that they found that the strongest associations, the strongest ones, were in the youth sample. So again, kind of reinforces the idea that adolescence is an important time for thinking about these issues. So that's something, maybe, hopefully I've convinced you that maybe you want to care about this a little bit. But a question that I've been thinking about for the last couple of years, and that I'm increasingly thinking about and trying to figure out is is it possible to use ERI? It's great, for kids' adjustment and things like that. It's a resource. It's one of many resources that they can have in their lives. But how can we make it a resource for them to be able to engage with peers who are from groups other than their own? Is that possible? Because it seems counterintuitive to sort of support, greater, more involvement and a deeper identity kind of process, and also kind of encourage them to look outside their group and interact with their group. I don't know, maybe it just seemed counterintuitive to me, but at first. But the question that I had was, can we use the identity process as part of a way to help them have better relationships? And in the course of writing a book with my colleague Adriana Manya-Taylor, we discovered that there's actually a lot of evidence for yes. So there's not I wouldn't say there's as much of a history of trying to answer this question as there is just looking at how ERI changes over time and how it's related to different things in adolescence, different aspects of adjustment and well-being. But it's really not out of the realm, and there are actually theories that support this possibility, which is really exciting to me because this is where I'm heading in my work. So some of the things that we learned were that there are some studies that suggest, most of these are correlational, and one of them is prospective, so it's something to think about. And one of them is my own, so I'll point to that one when we get to it, is that kids, so this is all with adolescents, and I think there's one study with young adults, who have a stronger and more positive ERI, who feel more secure in their sense of ERI, who knew more and felt a stronger sense of belonging to their group, and who had a greater sense of connection and attachment, tended to also say that they were interested in learning about people who were different from them. I actually found that they actually have more diverse friends later on. And they have more positive attitudes about out-group members, like people not from your group, and they have a greater enjoyment of meeting, spending time with, and befriending people who are different from them. So why might this be? We really were thinking about this, like how, there's one clear path for my colleague and I, because a lot of the literature that we have been engaged with really suggests that kids who are more secure in their sense of self, in terms of their ethnicity and race, might also be more secure in their sense of self in general, and might be therefore more comfortable in spaces that might be just uncomfortable for other people, but not for them. And so one of the pathways is having essentially a greater sense of confidence and self-assuredness in different diverse kinds of situations, and situations that take them out of their comfort zone. This is exemplified by this quote, which is by a woman who studies these issues, and this is actually from a webinar that she participated in about teaching race to children and adolescents. She was reflecting on her own experience, growing up, and sort of the messages that she got about being Black and what it was like. And so she says in this webinar, my dad was very intentional about, and really exemplifies a sense of self-confidence, right, in being in these different types of spaces. So my dad was very intentional about what he wanted us to learn. So I had a strong foundation, a sense of being Black and what it meant and what it should mean. It enabled me to feel more comfortable in my skin anywhere I went, at the Quaker high school I attended or the elite, predominantly white college I went to in the northern corner of Massachusetts. And it enabled me to know I could be or do anything I wanted to be or do. And that's just like one example of a kind of experience that would reflect, kind of this sense of, having a secure base from which to explore difference. Another kind of pathway is thinking about, youth who have a very strong connection to their ethnicity or race or that group, but they will tell you that it's only one of many identities that define them. And this is probably true for most of us. Like, if something can be important to us, but not be the everything that defines us. And so having a flexible sense of your identity and thinking about how ERI fits into that, kind of suite of parts of our, like different parts of ourselves, is an important idea for reconciling, having a stronger connection to your group and also being able to be open to interacting across difference. So this would entail not only your own beliefs, but I think also for young people, models, actual, people in their lives who kind of are, model for them that you can feel great about who you are and have a great connection to your group and feel like, yes, it's really important to be Puerto Rican, and being Puerto Rican is really, really, really central to my family. It's really part of how I define myself. But I also that doesn't mean that I'm not friends with, people who are not Puerto Rican, and also that I can have meaningful relationships outside of that social category, not just superficial relationships, but actual meaningful relationships. And this concept sometimes is called bridging, and so it's like the idea that, you can have this sort of connection to your group and also form a bridge to other groups. And that bridging concept comes from a famous theorist in this area, Bill Cross. So it's just another potential pathway there. And finally, of course, an important piece of the puzzle would be a sense of an orientation towards social justice. So this is actually a quote that comes from a teenager, she's 15, She says, to me, ethnicity means that I have an amazing history and that the family members, traditions, music, and other people that surround me have something to show me about my culture. Being Latina also means that during these controversial times, I must pay close attention to what is occurring politically, as it will affect both me and others of different cultures. And so this really exemplifies like the idea that, you know, it's possible, and it actually is very likely that as young people develop a more sophisticated sense of their identities in terms of ethnicity and race, that they may become aware of injustices more broadly that affect not only their group but other groups, and that they might develop, hopefully, a sense of empathy or a desire to advocate on behalf of those other groups. This concept is reflected in a theory of racial identity, and in that by Robert Sellers and his colleagues, and they call it the oppressed minority ideology. So it's the idea that there are many different types of oppression that parallel each other, and their groups, different ethnic and racial groups, experience not the same oppression, but they experience oppression, and that it's important to recognize that the commonality in having to experience oppression, and it's something that bonds people together from different ethnic and racial groups. Okay, so now we have come to the last segment of the talk, and which is to tell you a little bit, to give you some examples of how people actually do this work. Like, what do they actually do in schools, at home, and communities? And to set this up, I want to sort of be clear that, as Howard Stevenson says, there's no way that you can know how to do this or be ready to do this. There's no book for how to do this. I guess there are books technically that you can buy, but there's no easy way to do this. You just have to, like he says, you wouldn't do one night of algebra homework and expect to know all of algebra. It's the same with race. You need to practice, practice, practice. Okay, so what do people do in schools? Anti-bias approaches are really central to this, to being able to to provide spaces for teens to think through issues of identity while also forming connections to other kids and thinking about injustice. We can see this in curricula that are implemented. So there are actual there are a couple of different ones that I think, like ethnic studies curricula are a good example of how people try to do this. There are two other ones that I think are really interesting that I write about. One is called Perspectives for a Diverse America, that actually includes standards around different domains. So they have like 4 different domains, and one of them is specifically focused on identity, one's focused on justice, and one's focused on action. And they have all kinds of materials and tools for teachers and staff to use in schools to unpack, so that you can use text. There's like a library of different materials, text, movies, videos, lesson planning tools. It's really, really wonderful and free. And it's like, this is actually developed by Teaching Tolerance, which it may or may not be familiar to you, but it's the educational outreach arm of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So that's Perspectives for a Diverse America. Another way to think about these issues in schools in terms of curriculum is by infusing, or like by using a history curriculum, for example, Facing History in Ourselves, that provides opportunities for thinking about historical events while also walking kids through the process of thinking about what is we and what is they? Like, what does it mean to have an in-group identity, and what is an out-group, and how do they relate to each other now? And then have them walk through those kinds of processes and thinking about those issues through a series of activities and, texts and things related to a particular historical event. And they have 2 that they're really known for. Their signature curriculum is around the Holocaust, and they start with issues of identity as a way to enter conversation ultimately about the Holocaust. And the other one is about Little Rock. That is also, they start with issues of identity as a way to enter a conversation about that. These are ones that are focused on adolescence. There are also, of course, there's the issue of proficiency among the staff. So I collected many examples for my book about, what folks were doing. It's more idiosyncratic, things like reading groups. There's a school in Cambridge where they are getting together once a week. They're reading different types of pieces and reflecting on them together and really trying to process and then taking it out into their classrooms, into their subject areas as much as they can. There's also the idea of developing racial literacy, which comes from the work of, this is really an idea put forward by Howard Stevenson, which is learning how to recognize the emotion in racial situations and sort of how do you navigate the emotions that come up, whether it's fear, tension, anxiety, positive emotions even that might happen, and sort of learning how to be aware of that in the moment. And he does some really amazing, excellent, kind of work in that area and teaching teachers how to do that. And of course, issues of cultural competence more generally. In the family, I would advocate to continue anything that you do to teach your kids about heritage issues and connecting to their heritage. And there is another speaker in this series who really brings home the point that, maintaining your heritage language is a really valuable thing for kids. It's valuable cognitively, but it's also valuable, and I would argue, in terms of identity development issues, especially as you move into the teenage years. And really having that sense of connection and sense of being grounded in something, a group and a history is really going to be important. And being able to connect to family members through heritage language would be important. And then I would say that I would advocate for different versions of the talk, or the idea that racism is not just a topic for people who think their kids are going to be exposed to racism, but for everyone to talk about. And so figuring out how can you have these conversations in a way that's sensitive to your own kids, and knowing your own kid, like what does that conversation need to look like, or what are the many different experiences that you need to have with your kid to help them understand how racism operates in our society, and sort of how, what you do know and what you don't know, and being comfortable to kind of like ask questions together and figure out the answers together about things that you don't know. And with that, I would say that this quote really, I think, really exemplifies the idea that, it may be that, if you haven't gone, as she says, you haven't gone to a place of discomfort or worry or guilt, then it hasn't gone deep enough, because there is nothing that is challenging you or challenging your child to get outside of their comfort zone. But of course, only parents really know how to do that in a way that is sensitive to their child, or that makes sense for the context of their relationship with their child. Being a parent, I'm really sensitive to that too. In the community, there are not as many examples, but there's one really exciting one that draws from the framework of intergroup dialogues at the University of Michigan, which you may be familiar with. That's developed by Pat Gurin, and you're probably familiar with her. She's given one of these talks. And the idea is that youth come together in more homogenous groupings to talk about identity issues and sort of just things that make us similar, or that we think, make us similar to each other. And then there's a moment at which it's transition to have intergroup dialogues that are facilitated by a facilitator who's skilled in this. We do these at the college level, and there are people doing them with high school students and in the Detroit area, in the Detroit, within the metro area, involving kids from Detroit and kids from the suburbs, which I think is really exciting. And I haven't seen it other than in that context, but I think it's a really potentially interesting model for thinking about dialogues and bringing kids from different groups and different life experiences together. And of course, programs that are more idiosyncratic in the community, but they do have as one of their goals, thinking about issues of identity as a step toward developing agency in terms of socio-political agency. And folks are doing this with teens in community settings around the country, though they are, like I said, it's not like they've been replicated on a large scale. But there are programs out there that really take as their goal raising consciousness and this kind of idea of political voice. And part of the process in doing that, and this is with different ethnic and racial groups, is to think through issues of identity. So again, a space for where you can have kind of a positive sense of connection and at the same time be sensitive to issues of injustice or difference even, just in a more general way. So some takeaways as I conclude. I hope that if nothing else, you walk away knowing that there are many studies that show that ERI, supporting ERI in youth can be a great thing. It's a resource, especially for youth of color. We adults have an important role to play in the construction and the ERI that young people form and how it changes over time. And we should be more intentional and proactive about our roles. And also that, a strong ERI does not have to impede cross-group relations, given certain conditions, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, all of my work and that of many others suggests that colorblindness is not going to be a good approach. If the end goal is to kind of get more meaningful interaction across difference, pretending or stating that you don't see that part of a person or experience means that you're not actually fully capturing the humanity of that person, because for many people, race and their ethnicity is part of their experience that merits more explicit attention and even curiosity. So thank you. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators and my students, some of which are in the audience. Thanks, guys. Schools in which I've been able to do my research, and the Spencer Foundation for funding the development of some of these ideas and being able to share them with you today. Thank you.
This program was recorded on February 26, 2018 at the Ann Arbor District Library.